So to start off with, childhood trauma covers a lot, and we talk about it a lot. What's quite important to focus on is that the brain and the body develop in relation to our early life experiences. So if a child has had 5 different caregivers before the age of 2, been beaten, neglected, and sexually abused, their perception of the world, their brain wiring, their sensory system will be very different to the child who has had a normal, healthy start in life. If we just say the child has experienced childhood trauma, I'm pretty sure your reaction to that is a little bit less extreme. The effects of trauma mean that hypervigilance, cortisol, and adrenaline remain present even when our kids are resting, and it doesn't take much to push them over the edge. Adopted children carry huge amounts of shame, and the slightest raised voice or look can send a child into overload, so learning doesn't take place. What we really need is for educators to understand all of that, to understand that our child will behave differently and that they may be stuck in infant responses some of the time. They may have attachment disorders or insecure attachment. They may need to experience infant care, even though they are 5, 10, or 15 years old. And that really requires out of the box thinking. And it can be counterintuitive for some people. And I think if you are an educationalist who's quite traditional in their outlook, that requires a really big change in mindset for you. To avoid triggers and to provide the right kind of support for our kids, it will be necessary to think carefully about information relating to their early life experiences. And I think that's something for us to think about as adoptive parents. To be trauma responsive, educators need to listen to you and take the lead from you, and you need to think carefully about what they need to know about your child's early start. Childhood trauma affects the development of the child, we know that. There will be gaps, there will be shaky foundations, and we need to be able to focus on these before we can attend to things like attainment goals or the goals that are set by a child's chronological age. The safety markers of the environment and the people around our child will increase our child's coping mechanism. But if the environment or people are threatening, then our child will resort to survival strategies and their learning will suffer. On top of this, a neurological condition might also affect what the child can process, how they react, what their impulse control is like. What a child can do one day, they might not be able to do another. And that is not something that they can control. Many adoptive children struggle with relationships and the need to build relationships with adults before being able to branch out from their secure base with peers. So having access to a key adult in school is fundamental. You can extend that in education through mentoring programs. And I think the other thing for educators is that the key adult needs to understand developmental trauma. It is about relationships, but it's also about understanding what that child needs from a relationship. Adopted children are also going to likely need support for making and managing friendships throughout their school lives. So things like lunch times and break times, where there's a lot of peers kind of milling around, we need to think about how we provide a safe place for adopted children. They might need some kind of refuge from that threat, that perceived threat of the unstructured and unsupported time. Basically, we need an adult that is available to them. And the 16-year-old might need similar social supports to an 8-year-old. There's also executive function skills. Executive function skills are likely to require support. Children need support remembering basic tasks, homework, books, direction, and it can be really difficult for the adoptive parent if there isn't good home-school communication and the school expect the child to be independent. My teen will not remember homework, and unless I have the information, I can't help her. As an adoptive parent, I'm working to a different timescale with my child. She is going to need scaffolded supports for a lot longer than peers who didn't have the same start that she did. Domestic violence, toxic stress, substance abuse have lifelong consequences. There might be a high chance of FASD. Adoption itself, although the best choice for the child given the circumstances, brings its own trauma too, which will require support and understanding, lifelong support and understanding. Just because a child was adopted at birth does not mean that everything is going to be fine, and that's something that we need educators to understand. Adoptive parents are not anxious parents. They are parents that are looking for the best outcomes for their child from the system. Their child has more to deal with than peers. The adoptive parent is likely to have done lots of parenting courses, lots of training, lots of reading. They will have earned knowledge and developed skills. We need professionals and educators to make room for adoptive parents in their professional discussions. We need to make sure that we are not undervalued as parents. FASD is 4 times more likely in the care experience group and at the highest in those children who have been adopted. There is a high chance of additional support needs being present in the histories of biological parents. It's possible that undiagnosed needs have been medicated through drug or alcohol use, which may or may not be documented in a child's history. There might be complicated genetic factors. There might be a higher chance of hereditary conditions being passed on, or there might be no history at all of biological parents. The more complex needs, the greater the chance there is of there being no diagnosis, or the diagnosis being incomplete, or there might be too many traits present to attribute one label to, or the child might refuse to engage in any assessments. In the case of FASD, there might be no record of alcohol consumption in medical notes. The child might not have that diagnosis to go alongside it. The bottom line for educators is that we need to assume assessments are required. Early intervention is going to be the best approach. The GIRFIC policy and the guidance around care experience supports. The guidance around care experience supports the presumption of additional support needs. But what we need now is for that to be reflected in practice. Imagine walking into your new workplace where you know nobody, and your boss asking you in front of everyone to explain how and why your marriage broke up in front of strangers. And effectively, that's kind of what happened to my daughter during her first week at high school when the RE teacher asked her for the whole class to write about their life story as a way of getting to know them. It was something really very personal to her that she was asked to think about and talk about and write about with strangers. During her first year at high school, she read Frankenstein, which was all about father figures when she doesn't have one in her life. It was all about early caregiving and neglect, which is hugely triggering for her. She looked at The Hunger Games, which was all about fear and manipulation and survival. Fantastic film, but potentially very triggering for her. She read a book, pretty sure the book was called Abomination, that seemed to be about a child that was kept in a basement. Hugely, hugely triggering. None of these things was I informed about in advance, by the way. And the point here is that the curriculum content for her emphasised her difference when she was at her most vulnerable and stressed and unsettled in school. There are some parts of the curriculum that we have to teach as educators, but we really do need to think really carefully about how we do that and if we actually need to do it the way that we think we do as educators. For my daughter, the teacher's approach made the difference to what she could cope with and how safe she felt. So, you know, that book about the child in the basement, which I was horrified by, I think my daughter actually quite enjoyed going through that because she felt safe with the teacher. She felt kind of held by the teacher in that context. We, as adoptive parents, need to ask educators to audit their curriculum content for triggers and adapt their approaches. So if it's possible for you to avoid a triggering experience, do that. And if not, think about what you can do differently to increase felt safety at this time and make sure that there is an exit strategy for a child that gets overwhelmed. It is an absolute minefield and quite difficult for our children if they come across adoption in literature or films, and they weren't prepared for that. So here's an example of this being handled very badly from our experience. As an adoptive parent, I think I'm quite good at trying to minimise triggers and provide support. So I'd arranged for a social worker to go into my child's school, talk about adoption. And in the child planning meeting, we talked about the importance of prior warnings, of tricky subjects for adopted children, so I could prepare her at home. So imagine my surprise when I'd gone and I'd done all of that, when she came home with a reading book the following week, and on the second page I read, "Your mum didn't want you, not your real one. My dad says you're lucky that Mr. and Mrs. Watson took you in. You might have been left lying on the doorstep in a hospital." I was enraged, because these hurtful words, they stick, and the misinformation in books which perpetuate adoption myths can be really damaging. And adoption and abuse features in so many stories that we really need to be mindful of what it is that we choose to read and watch in school. We need to make sure that the family is prepared, that we take on board their responses and their perspective of a book. We need to question the narrative in the adoption narrative whenever we come across it as well, I think. We are aiming to change the narrative around care experience and to remove the stigma of care through all the work of the promise. And we need to make sure that we do the same for adoption too. Adoption UK have got a Talking About Adoption fact sheet that might help educators to educate the general public about adoption and be more supportive in conversations. The drive to fit in and blend is really strong for our kids, but it is quite a difficult thing to do, I think, when you're adopted, and there can be quite complex factors involving nationality and culture that go around that too. My daughter doesn't like anything to do with a Scots focus because it triggers feelings of loss for her. And for children who are adopted from overseas, race might also be an issue. A Black child living with white parents might find that their adoption becomes something that crops up very early on in relationships with people, and something that they have to confront when they'd rather not. So what do we want educators to do about that? We need them to be aware of the complexities of some of this. We need them to be aware that identity or processing identity as an adopted person is a normal, healthy thing to do. We have to look at identity as we grow up, but it's a really very difficult thing for our young people to do nonetheless. So as educators, we can provide support when it's needed. We can look for mentors, we can look for counselling, we can provide spaces, safe spaces, we can provide safe key adults that are available to our children. And we can remember that attachment can muddy the waters, and that children might push or pull an adoptive parent when they're going through a particularly intense period of processing. And as an educator, we need to make sure that we inform and involve and stay connected to adoptive parents throughout their education journey. This is something else that's come up a lot, are the repeated comments that our young people can get in school. And they can come from places of ignorance, or they can be designed to be deliberately hurtful. And they can reinforce the negative self-voice that our adopted child has. It can be difficult to recover from and escape from at school, especially if you throw in a neurodivergent mind, which sees relationships differently or where thinking can get stuck. So when the child reaches a boiling point, and can't cope anymore, and they're overwhelmed and they lash out, we need to recognise where that comes from and acknowledge that there is an unheard kind of build up behind that, and look to address the bigger picture and not just see a single episode of reaction, but see the whole thing. So we would ask educators to review relationship and bullying policies. Do you mention adoption? How do you address talking about adoption? How do you ensure pupils and staff recognise adoption myth from reality? And how do you correct misinformation? Have your adoptive families fed into your policy? So a few things to think about. If you focus on childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, violence, or substance abuse at any point in your curriculum or in your school, then you need to prepare your adoptive family. Give them advance notice, predict responses based on your prior knowledge of the child, prepare support in advance, make sure that there are alternative arrangements in place or an exit strategy. Don't punish the child if they can't cope. And a great example from a colleague of mine about how a school can get it right. It was Children in Need Today, and her son, who's got an FASD diagnosis, was in P3. Everybody was dressed up with lots of fun activities going on, none of the usual routine. And at the end of the day, when she collected her son, and the head teacher said, "Today, your son kicked a hole in the wall of the toilets. It's okay. We know he's dysregulated. It's fine. I just wanted you to know in case he mentioned it." No shaming, just recognition of the overwhelm and the trigger, and somebody putting 2 and 2 together, and the desire to make sure that parents could continue the support after the child had a tough day at school. Being called out to give an answer, being called out to speak to a teacher, or expected to change for PE in front of others, all of these things can make a child feel really exposed and might ramp up their survival behaviours. And we know that a child can either internalise or externalise their anxiety. So depending on their flight, fight, freeze, or fawn responses, you might not actually notice the anxiety in school. You might be faced with aggressive behaviours in the moment. But educators can help to reduce anxiety by helping the child to feel safe in school. And they can do that through a safe adult relationship, and they can make sure that a child has an advocate, especially in high school, somebody where that person can help the child to navigate the multiple relationships that they have in high school, where there's maybe a greater chance of communication perhaps being missed somewhere along the line because there are so many relationships. Without the right understanding and supports, the anxiety might spiral into school refusal. And we need to be aware that our children might still need co-regulation and connection as teens, and even more so when they're at that crucial developmental stage of exploring identity. And again, they might be 12 or 13 years old, but they might have the coping skills and the attachment of a much younger child. And you might not be able to see that from the way that they dress or talk. But as an educator, you have to have that in your mind. And I think this might be one of the last slides I've got here. Where needs are really complex, it can be exhausting. So parenting or teaching can feel like an impossible task. The child's needs can be overwhelming, and a parent might become so stretched that they're operating in survival mode for some of that time. It's exhausting. There might be little respite available, especially for single parents. And we've also got the fact that services often disengage when the needs of the child are too complex for them, but the parent has to keep going. Or if the child is overwhelmed, then the parent might not be able to get them to the service to engage in support or assessment. And I think sometimes what comes through in the helpline and the conversations that we have with people is that a parent can feel blamed by professionals who maybe don't quite get the extent of the trauma or the complexity of need. And sometimes maybe there is a feeling of judgment creeping in somewhere. And what parents need when they reach out, when they're emotionally stretched and exhausted, and maybe on the verge of compassion fatigue, what they need most is understanding from educators and professionals. They need the support, they need to be backed up, they need respite, and they need professionals to keep in mind that the parent has this vast knowledge of parenting, trauma, and neurodiversity, but they might just simply be at that point of exhaustion. And again, the adoptive parent can be the Coke can kid. So the effort of managing school is really hard. And if teachers don't get masking and say that everything is fine in school, there's that kind of implication that if everything's fine in school, then there must be something wrong somewhere else. And again, that's that idea of parenting blame creeping in there. And I suppose what we also want to be aware of is that the reality is that the education system can be traumatizing to our children. So we need educators to work with us to understand all of this and help remove barriers and increase the supports for us.
Paula, what hit me during that was the exhaustion sometimes of looking after care experienced children and teaching care experienced children. And yeah, like I've definitely experienced that myself as a teacher formerly. And yeah, like it can be really overwhelming. So yeah, I just wanted to say that's what hit me again during what you were saying.
I've got a little video which I was going to show in a little while, but maybe if I show the video first and then give you the option of coming back and discussing.
I have seen Matilda, Star Wars and Despicable Me. What I like about Matilda is that at the end she does get a loving home. I like how Matilda has superpowers and she can like move things with her mind. I think the most subjects that are hard for me is science or like art. Even though art is a good subject, I don't think that we should do family trees as much. The same in like French or language lessons where you have to write it in a different language, even though that is still difficult because you still have to think about like it's more complicated than everyone else. I didn't like it in science when the teacher said biological parents because it just made me feel really uncomfortable, and every time she said birth dad, that also made me feel really uncomfortable as well. I think the best way in this situation is just either asking the teacher if I could stand outside for a minute or like just taking a little breather outside. That just really helps. She did take me aside before we started these type of lessons and she said, do you want me to change and like rephrase any of my words? Instead of using birth, I said, could she use biological instead? I know it's not perfect, but it's just a little bit better than saying birth family. Also, that teacher took everyone aside, not just me. She took everyone aside and said, is there any words that you don't want me to use? And that'll make a difference. I think what's really important for schools definitely is I think they could have like an assembly about adoption, and the people that are actually adopted, you could take them aside and say, is this alright? Do you want to be a part of the assembly? Do you not even want to be in assembly? And you could ask one of the teachers, hey, can you take these people in? They do not feel comfortable being in the assembly. They could just have a worksheet to go through. I think it's really important that people know about adoption and also what language not to use and use. I think the words that I'm talking about are biological. You can take them aside and say, is there a better option that I could say? Because everyone's different. They might have a different take in what they want to say and not want to say. Even when my mum is using like birth family and biological words like that, I still get really uncomfortable. I would rather she just called them by their names because they're still a part of my family, even though I don't live with them. I think when I started high school, we had RE, but that first lesson he asked us to do a life story, and that put me off everything about that teacher, everything about that classroom, everything about just even that hallway. Like I start to feel more shaky than usual. I can't step in that classroom anymore. I didn't want to share my life stories because I didn't know that person. I didn't know the teacher. It was the first lesson as well. Like he could have done it differently, I say. Another thing that I want to say is that you should never assume anything of anyone. You should always ask. So you're just, even if you just like assume like, oh yeah, they have a sibling. Never assume anything of anyone. Always ask, because it could be because everyone's different. What also helps is having other friends that are adopted like your situation. So you're just like, oh yeah, sometimes I feel like this, and they're just like, oh, same. Because you just feel related to that person so very much.
I don't know if that kind of made you think about anything that you wanted to share. I think that the other thing for me as well, you know, when I became an adoptive parent and I'd done all the training, and I thought, all right, okay, I kind of, you know, I'm prepared. I know what's going to happen here. And then as I've gone on, I mean, my knowledge now is phenomenal compared to what it was, you know, 5 years ago. And I'm 9 years into my journey, and I'm learning all the time. So for a teacher who's at the very start of the journey, who's never had an adopted kid or a care experienced kid in their classroom, but who's done the training and the prep and thinking, yeah, I know what's going on here. The reality of actually facing it and putting the two and two together is a process, and a process takes time. When you're dealing with somebody who's got their ears closed, that's the really frustrating part. Teachers who work in the system, because of course education is a system, and the longer you've been in the system and the more you're going through the different channels of stuff, you can become, I think, what did he used to say? I think he used to say systemized. You kind of lose some of that flexibility of thinking that you had when you started, where you were, you know, you were able to think out the box, but you become so used to, I have to do it this way, because that's the policy and that's the procedure, and you forget that actually you're working with human beings who don't fit into boxes. In education, we have to remember that. And if we're going to be, we talk a lot about trauma informed and trauma responsive, and it's a bit like that childhood trauma. It covers so much, and you can't do it unless you are aware of who you're really speaking to and what they've been through. You need that knowledge.